Look at your hand right now. No, seriously, stop whatever you're doing and just look at it. The color you're seeing, whether it's pale ivory, golden tan, rich brown, or deep ebony, is not decoration. It's not random, and it is definitely not what most of history tried to tell you it was. That color is a message, a survival story, a scar, an echo of a decision your ancestors' bodies made tens of thousands of years ago. A decision they didn't get to choose, couldn't opt out of, and had no words for. And here's the part that will wreck everything you thought you knew. If your skin is light, what we casually call white or pale or fair, you are looking at one of the most recently evolved traits in all of human history. More recent than agriculture, more recent than cities, more recent than pottery, more recent than the wheel. In the grand, sweeping 300,000-year timeline of our species, white skin is basically brand new. And the story of how it got here? It involves mass death, invisible poison, desperate genetic accidents, and a farming catastrophe that nobody planned and almost nobody survived intact. This is that story. Here is the claim we are going to prove across the next 2 hours. Every single human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, descended from ancestors who had dark skin. Not metaphorically dark, not kinda brownish, dark, deeply, richly, melanin-saturated dark. For the first 240,000 years of our species' existence, there was no variation in skin color worth talking about. If you could travel back to Africa 100,000 years ago and stand in a crowd of anatomically modern humans, creatures who were, genetically and physically, us, you would not find a single pale face, not one. The variation we see today, the entire breathtaking spectrum from the deepest Yoruba complexion to the most translucent Scandinavian skin, emerged in an evolutionary blink. We're talking about the last 40 to 50,000 years. For a species that has existed for 300,000 years, that's the final 15% of our timeline. Most of the dramatic lightening of human skin, it happened in the last 10,000 years. Some of the most critical genetic shifts, the last 6,000. Your great go back about 300 generations. Grandmother. She looked nothing like a modern Norwegian. And a modern Norwegian's ancestors, they looked a great deal more like someone you'd see in East Africa today. This is not a story about race. This is a story about sunlight, about a single vitamin, about women dying in childbirth because the sky was too gray, about random genetic typos that accidentally saved civilizations. And by the end of this, I promise you, the concept of race as a biological category, as something written into your fundamental humanity, will no longer make any sense to you whatsoever. Not because of ideology, because of science. Let's go back to the beginning. The real beginning. Picture the world your earliest ancestors lived in. Not the Africa of today, though much of it remains. The Africa of the Middle Pleistocene. Grasslands stretching to every horizon. Scattered acacia trees throwing almost no shade. And above all of it, always, relentlessly, a sun that wasn't just warming the earth. It was assaulting it. At midday near the equator, ultraviolet radiation doesn't come from the side or at an angle. It comes straight down. No filtering, no oblique geometry to soften it. It pours out of the sky like liquid fire you can't see, can't feel, until the damage is done. This is the environment in which Homo sapiens was forged, not in forests, where canopies filter 70% of UV before it reaches the ground. Not in temperate climates where seasonal clouds provide regular relief. In open savanna, exposed, upright. That upright posture, the very thing that defines us as a species, that freed our hands, that let us hunt and make tools and eventually point at stars, came with a cost nobody planned for. When our ape ancestors walked on all fours, most of their skin was shaded by their own body. The sun hit primarily their backs, and thick body hair provided additional UV protection. When our ancestors stood up, and over hundreds of thousands of years, lost most of their body hair, probably to improve cooling through sweating during long-distance hunts, they exposed massive surface areas of bare skin directly to the most intense ultraviolet radiation on the planet. This was a biological crisis of the highest order, and evolution had to solve it, or we would have died out before agriculture, before language, before fire. The solution was melanin. Melanin is a pigment produced by specialized cells, melanocytes, sitting in the deepest layer of your skin. It comes in several forms, but the most important for UV protection is eumelanin, the brown-black pigment responsible for darker skin tones. Here's what eumelanin does that sounds almost magical when you break it down at the molecular level. It absorbs photons of ultraviolet radiation and converts them into harmless heat before they can penetrate to the deeper layers of skin. Before they can reach the blood vessels, the DNA-rich cells, the delicate biological machinery that keeps you alive. Think of it as billions of microscopic umbrellas, each one opened and waiting, spread throughout the upper layers of your skin. Dark skin, skin with high eumelanin concentration, can neutralize UV radiation somewhere between 30 and 90 times more effectively than very pale skin. It's not perfect. Nothing in evolution is perfect. But it is extraordinarily effective. But here's the specific reason this mattered for survival, and it's not what most people assume. The primary threat wasn't sunburn. Sunburn is painful and can eventually cause cancer. Yes, but cancer typically strikes late in life, after reproduction. Natural selection doesn't care much about what happens after your children are grown. The primary threat was a B vitamin called folate. Folate, also known as vitamin B9, is absolutely essential for human survival. It protects DNA during cell division. Without it, neural tubes don't close properly in developing embryos. Pregnancies fail, spines don't form, brains develop incorrectly. Even in adults, severe folate deficiency causes anemia, immune dysfunction, the inability to heal properly. And ultraviolet radiation destroys folate in the bloodstream with chilling efficiency. Studies show that just a few hours of intense UV exposure can degrade circulating folate levels by more than half. Now, imagine a human ancestor spending 12 hours a day outdoors, hunting, gathering, foraging, traveling between water sources. Without heavy melanin protection, their folate reserves would be in constant, catastrophic freefall. The women whose skin lacked adequate melanin would have experienced higher rates of pregnancy failure and birth defects. Their children would be born with compromised nervous systems, their grandchildren fewer in number. Within just a few thousand generations, a heartbeat in evolutionary time, Natural selection had ensured a near-universal outcome. Every human in equatorial Africa had dark skin, deeply, richly dark, not as an aesthetic choice, not as a mark of identity, as a survival requirement. Dark skin was not a variation, it was the template. Dark skin was the perfect adaptation for the African sun. It was the biological armor of our species for 240,000 years. So why did any human ever lose it? What could possibly make perfect armor into a liability? We're about to find out, and the answer is going to make you deeply uncomfortable about how we've talked about skin color for the last 2,000 years. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, something happened that would change the biological destiny of our entire species. A small group of people left. Not an army, not a civilization. Probably fewer than a few hundred individuals, maybe less. One of several small bands that had been probing northward during favorable climate windows, following game herds and water sources, pushing further and further from the African heartland. Most of these migrations probably ended in retreat or extinction. The world outside Africa was not a welcome place. It was foreign, unpredictable, often hostile. Climate cycles swung wide. Food sources were unfamiliar. Landscapes carried no ancestral memory. But this particular group, the one whose genetic descendants you and I, and virtually every non-African person on Earth, carry inside us, made it through. They crossed the land bridge between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula during a period when the Red Sea was narrower and sea levels were lower. They moved along coastlines, eating shellfish and fish, following routes their predecessors had scratched into tribal memory. They moved through what is now the Middle East, into the Indian subcontinent, into East Asia, and some of them eventually pushed north, into Europe, into Central Asia, into the vast cold gray territories where the sun behaved in ways no human biology had ever needed to prepare for. They carried everything they needed. Their intelligence, their tools, their social bonds, their languages, their accumulated survival knowledge, and they carried their dark skin, the same dark skin that had protected their ancestors from the brutal African sun for hundreds of thousands of years. In Europe and Northern Asia, that skin was about to become a slow-motion death sentence. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about physics. Ultraviolet radiation, specifically UVB, the wavelength responsible for vitamin D synthesis in skin, doesn't behave the same way at all latitudes. Near the equator, the sun is overhead for most of the year. Its rays travel through the minimal possible column of atmosphere before hitting the ground. UVB arrives intense, direct, powerful. Dark skin, with its heavy eumelanin content, blocks roughly 90% of incoming UVB, but 10% still gets through. And in equatorial Africa, 10% of very intense UVB is more than enough to synthesize all the vitamin D a human body needs. Move to Northern Europe, to Scandinavia, to Britain, to the Russian steppe. Now the geometry changes completely. The sun never climbs overhead. Even at the summer solstice, it reaches only 45 to 50 degrees above the horizon at peak. Its rays are traveling through far more atmosphere, filtering out most UVB before it arrives. And in winter, from roughly October to March at latitudes above 50 degrees north, the sun's angle is so low that virtually no UVB-generating radiation reaches the ground at all, regardless of cloud cover. You could stand outside naked in a Norwegian January and produce essentially zero vitamin D. Now, apply that physics to a dark-skinned person who just walked into this environment carrying skin evolved to block 90% of UV radiation. In Africa, 10% penetration of high-intensity UV was plenty. In Northern Europe, 10% of barely detectable UVB, filtered through months of cloud cover and oblique sun angles, produces almost nothing. You're essentially living in a UV vacuum. The body needs vitamin D. It needs it desperately and continuously, and it's not getting any. Before we go further, I need to make sure you understand what vitamin D actually is, because it's been so thoroughly marketed as a supplement that most people have lost track of how fundamental it is to survival. Vitamin D is not really a vitamin. It's a hormone. Your body synthesizes it when UVB radiation strikes the cholesterol in your skin cells, triggering a cascade of chemical transformations that eventually produce calcitriol, the biologically active form. Calcitriol then acts as a messenger across dozens of different physiological systems. Its most famous role is calcium metabolism. Without adequate vitamin D, your body cannot properly absorb calcium from food into the bloodstream. And without calcium in the bloodstream, bones don't mineralize correctly. They stay soft, porous, prone to deformation under the mechanical stresses of a human body. In children, this manifests as rickets. Rickets is not just bent legs, though bent legs are the most visible symptom. It is a systemic failure of skeletal development. The rib cage deforms, developing painful irregularities called rachitic rosary. The skull softens and can misshape under its own weight. The spine curves. Growth is stunted. The child is in chronic pain. Their muscles weaken because calcium is also essential for muscular contraction. In adults, the equivalent condition is called osteomalacia, a gradual demineralization of existing bone. Fractures happen from routine activities. Joints ache, muscles cramp. The immune system, which is heavily regulated by vitamin D receptors, starts to fail. But here is the detail that makes this an evolutionary crisis rather than just a health crisis. Vitamin D deficiency kills women in childbirth. Not quickly, not obviously, but with terrible systematic consistency. Here's the mechanism. The female pelvis contains the birth canal, the bony passage through which a newborn must travel. Its shape is determined during adolescent development, when bones are still forming and growing. If a girl grows up with chronic vitamin D deficiency, if her bones don't mineralize correctly during those critical years, her pelvis doesn't develop the right geometry. The bones are positioned at subtly wrong angles. The internal dimensions are slightly too narrow. In the modern world, that problem is solved by cesarean section. In prehistoric Europe, 30,000 years ago, there was no such option. A malformed pelvis meant obstructed labor. Obstructed labor meant death. For the mother, for the infant, both. Let that land for a moment. The women dying this way were not the weak or the unlucky. They were the ones who had survived childhood, who were healthy enough and strong enough to attract mates and conceive. They had done everything biologically right, and then the shape of their skeleton, determined years earlier by insufficient sunlight, killed them at the moment of their species' most essential act. The math cascades. If even 1 in 5 women in each generation died this way, and the archaeological evidence suggests it was higher. If survivors produced fewer children due to compromised immune function and chronic illness, populations couldn't sustain themselves. Groups shrank. Genetic diversity collapsed. Over a few thousand years, dark-skinned populations in high-latitude environments would simply go extinct. And yet they didn't. Something happened. Something changed. Not deliberately. Not by design. Randomly. We're not speculating about this. The evidence is written in bone. On archaeological excavations from early human settlements in northern Europe, from Britain to Germany to the Scandinavian peninsula, have consistently uncovered skeletal remains bearing the unmistakable signature of vitamin D deficiency. Bowed tibias and femurs, deformed rib cages, pelvic bones with abnormal geometry, inconsistent with any known trauma, skulls with abnormal thickening or softening in regions that indicate impaired mineralization during development. These aren't rare finds. They appear with striking frequency across dozens of sites, spanning thousands of years. The chemical record confirms the skeletal evidence. Stable isotope analysis of ancient bones can detect markers of metabolic stress. Bone mineral density measurements reveal populations that were consistently chronically undernourished in ways that align perfectly with vitamin D deficiency rather than simple caloric shortage. And when geneticists began sequencing ancient European DNA, a technology that has only become truly powerful in the last decade, the picture became even starker. The earliest Europeans for whom we have good genetic data, hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, still carried the genetic variants associated with dark skin, the mutations for lighter pigmentation that would eventually dominate European populations were either absent or present only in small minority fractions. These people were trying to survive the northern latitudes with African skin. The most stunning example in the public record is a man known as Cheddar Man. He lived in what is now Somerset, England, approximately 9,700 years ago. His remains, preserved in a limestone cave with remarkable completeness, allowed a full genetic analysis in 2018. What that analysis revealed shook a lot of assumptions. Cheddar Man had blue eyes and dark skin, not somewhat brownish. Dark skin. The genetic markers are unambiguous. He was a hunter-gatherer living in Britain 9,000 years after modern humans first arrived in Europe, and he still had not evolved the pale skin we associate with Northern Europeans today. The ancient Briton you might imagine, ruddy-cheeked, fair-skinned, a kind of prehistoric Englishman, did not exist. The people who built the initial settlements of what would become England looked far more like East Africans or South Asians than like any modern Northern European. A pale skin in Britain is a recent import, recent enough to have arrived after farming, in some cases after pottery. The migrating modern humans weren't walking into empty landscapes. Europe and Asia already had people. Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, had lived in Europe and Western Asia for somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years. They were not the shambling brutes of old popular imagination. They buried their dead. They created ochre and shell jewelry. They controlled fire. Some evidence suggests they had basic language. They were cognitively sophisticated, physically powerful, and deeply adapted to cold northern climates. Modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in parts of Europe and the Middle East for thousands of years. And the genetic evidence now tells us definitively what that coexistence sometimes involved. They had children together. If you are of European or East Asian descent, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA came from Neanderthals. It's not a metaphor or an approximation. You carry actual Neanderthal genetic sequences inherited through thousands of generations of interbreeding that happened when our ancestors shared landscapes with theirs. Further east, in the caves of the Altai Mountains in Siberia, another group we call Denisovans left their own genetic mark. Modern populations in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands carry Denisovan DNA, including, in some Tibetan populations, a Denisovan inherited gene that enables survival at extreme altitude by regulating hemoglobin levels. The story of human skin color, then, is not a story of one people becoming different things. It is a story of multiple lineages meeting, mixing, combining, and adapting, a tangled genetic web that makes any clean line of racial ancestry an absurdity from the start. The stage is set: dark-skinned modern humans in the north, a vitamin D crisis growing more acute with every generation, and a biological system that has no conscious goal, no divine plan, no awareness of the problem at all. All it can do is wait for a mistake, an accident, a random copying error in someone's DNA. And when that accident happens, in some individual whose name we will never know, in some camp we will never find, everything is about to change. Evolution doesn't have goals. It doesn't have foresight. It doesn't look at a dying population and say, what they need is a mutation for lighter skin. It doesn't care about the problem. It doesn't know the problem exists. All evolution does is this: changes happen randomly in DNA, through copying errors during cell division, through radiation damage, through chemical exposure. And occasionally, one of those changes happens to provide a survival advantage in the current environment. The individual carrying that change has slightly more surviving children. Their children have more children. Over generations, the change spreads. That's it. That's the entire process. Random accident meets environmental pressure. The accident persists because it helps. The math compounds. And somewhere in Northern Europe or the Middle East, between 20 and 30,000 years ago, the exact random accident that would transform the appearance of an entire continent happened in a gene called SLC24A5. SLC24A5 codes for a protein, a solute carrier, embedded in the membranes of melanocytes. Its normal job is to transport ions across the cell membrane, a process that regulates the chemistry inside the melanin-producing compartments of the cell. When it functions normally, when it carries the ancestral variant, melanocytes produce robust levels of eumelanin. The mutation? A single nucleotide change, one letter in a genome of 3 billion, adenine instead of threonine, at position 111. The effect? The altered protein doesn't transport ions as efficiently. Melanin production drops in individuals carrying 2 copies of the mutation by somewhere between 30 and 40%. The first human born with this mutation would have been noticeably lighter than everyone around them. Not the pale ivory of modern Northern Europeans. The full lightening effect requires multiple mutations in multiple genes working together, but meaningfully lighter, different. In most places, at most moments in evolutionary history, this mutation would have been inconsequential. Slightly lighter skin in a high UV environment is actually a disadvantage. Increased folate destruction, increased risk of sun damage. The mutation would have floated in the gene pool at low frequency and likely disappeared within a few generations. But this wasn't most places. This wasn't most moments. This was Northern Europe. This was a population where dark skin was actively, measurably, catastrophically killing people, where women's pelvises were deforming during childhood because they couldn't produce enough vitamin D, where infant mortality was soaring, where immune systems were failing, where the human body was losing a slow war against physics. Into this context, a person with 30% less melanin, they could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently from the weak northern sun. Their blood calcium levels were higher. Their bones mineralized more completely during development. If female, their pelvis formed with correct geometry. They delivered children successfully. Their children survived winters. Their darker-skinned contemporaries didn't. They had more children. Their children had more children. And here's what the math of natural selection does with even a modest advantage. If individuals carrying this mutation had even a 10% higher rate of surviving and reproducing, if 10% more of their children reached adulthood and had families of their own, the frequency of the mutation in the population would roughly double every few hundred years. Within 1,000 years, it goes from 1% to tens of percent. Within 3,000, it can dominate a population. The SLC24A5 mutation that causes pale skin in modern Europeans today is found in nearly 100% of European populations. Its frequency curve tells geneticists that it underwent what's called a selective sweep, a period of extremely intense positive selection where it spread so fast through the population that nearby genomic regions were pulled along with it, like a boat dragged in the wake of a speedboat. The speed of this sweep was extraordinary. It tells us the selection pressure was not mild. It was ferocious, survival or death ferocious. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. East Asian populations, the ancestors of modern Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Southeast Asian peoples, also developed lighter skin as they moved into northern latitudes. They also faced the same vitamin D crisis. They also needed to evolve a solution. But they didn't use SLC24A5. The SLC24A5 mutation that transformed European skin color. In East Asian populations, it's virtually absent. They solved the problem through entirely different genes, primarily EDAR, OCA2, and a handful of others we're still characterizing. Think about what that means. Two completely separate human populations on opposite sides of a continent facing the same biological problem. Too much melanin for too little sunlight. Evolved lighter skin through completely different genetic mechanisms at roughly the same time. This is what biologists call convergent evolution, the same outcome achieved through different routes. Like how powered flight evolved independently in birds, bats, and insects, same basic aerodynamic problem, completely different anatomical solutions. EDAR is particularly fascinating because it doesn't just affect skin color. The EDAR variant, common in East Asian populations, also influences hair shaft thickness, producing the characteristically thick, round, straight hair common in East Asian and indigenous American populations, tooth morphology, and the density and type of sweat glands. This suggests a possibility. The East Asian skin lightening mutation may have initially spread for reasons that had nothing to do with vitamin D. Perhaps it was selected for cold climate hair insulation or sweat gland efficiency in cold environments. The skin lightening might have been a fortuitous side effect, beneficial in northern environments, but not the primary reason the mutation propagated. Or it may have been all of the above simultaneously. Evolution doesn't separate these variables cleanly. The bottom line is this: pale skin, as a trait, didn't happen once. It happened at least twice, probably more times in smaller populations, through different mechanisms, at different moments in history. It is not a singular invention. It is a parallel discovery. Nature writing the same adaptation in different handwriting. Until very recently, everything I've described was theoretical. We knew the genes, we knew the population distributions, but we couldn't directly observe the transition. Then, the ancient DNA revolution happened. Starting around 2010 and accelerating dramatically through the 2000s and into the present decade, researchers learned to extract, sequence, and analyze DNA from ancient skeletal remains with increasing reliability and precision. They began building databases of European genomes stretching back 40,000 years. What they found rewrote the history of European skin color in ways that surprised even the researchers who made the discoveries. Ancient European hunter-gatherers, the populations that inhabited Europe from the initial modern human migrations until roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, were overwhelmingly dark-skinned. The SLC24A5 variant is either absent from their genomes or present at very low frequency. They had been living in Europe for tens of thousands of years without evolving the pale skin we now associate with Northern Europeans. Then, starting roughly 10,000 years ago, something changes in the genetic record. Rapidly, dramatically, light skin variants begin appearing and spreading. Their frequency in the population jumps from low single digits to near universality in a span of roughly 5 to 8,000 years. 5 to 8,000 years. In evolutionary timescales, that is almost instantaneous. The question is, what happened 10,000 years ago that could drive natural selection with that kind of ferocity? Something changed around 10,000 years ago that pushed the evolution of pale skin into hyperdrive. It wasn't just the cold. It wasn't just the darkness. It was something humans did to themselves, a choice that seemed like progress, but turned out to be the most devastating nutritional catastrophe in our species' history. We'll get to that, but first, there's another detail in the ancient DNA that we can't skip. Cheddar Man, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, living in Britain 9,700 years ago, was not exceptional. He was typical. The ancient hunter-gatherers of Europe, from Ireland to Romania to Ukraine, almost universally show this same combination: genes for dark skin, often combined with genes for light eye color, a combination that strikes us today as jarring and unexpected. It wasn't. It was the standard Northern European look for tens of thousands of years. Around 10,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent of what is now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, human beings did something that would reshape civilization, rewrite our biology, and, accidentally, turbocharge the evolution of skin color. They started farming. The agricultural revolution is usually taught as an unambiguous triumph, and in the very long run, in the sense that it enabled population growth, specialization, cities, literacy, science, and every technology that followed. It was. Without it, none of us exist in our current form. But for the people who actually lived through the transition, for the first agricultural populations, it was a nutritional catastrophe of the first order. The archaeological record is clear on this point. Skeletal remains from early agricultural settlements are dramatically worse health markers than remains from hunter-gatherer populations living in the same regions just a few thousand years earlier. Early farmers were shorter, sometimes by 2 to 3 inches compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Their bones show more signs of metabolic stress and infection. Their teeth are riddled with decay from high carbohydrate diets. They show evidence of anemia, vitamin deficiencies, and a range of disease burdens that hunter-gatherers rarely suffered. The hunter-gatherer diet was extraordinarily diverse. In any given season, a group might consume 30, 40, 50 different plant species, supplemented by diverse animal proteins, from large game to fish, shellfish, insects, bird eggs. This variety ensured broad nutritional coverage without any conscious planning. Early agriculture collapsed that diversity into 2 or 3 staple crops: wheat and barley in the Middle East, rice and millet in China, corn and beans in Mesoamerica, sorghum and yams in Africa. These crops are calorie-dense. They're easy to store. They allow population densities that hunting and gathering can never support. But they are nutritionally narrow in ways that have dramatic biological consequences. And here is the specific consequence that matters for the skin color story. Plants don't make vitamin D. Almost none of it. Essentially zero, nutritionally speaking. Hunter-gatherers in northern latitudes had a biological safety net that compensated, at least partially, for the low UV radiation of northern winters. They ate fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, herring, trout. Fatty cold water fish are among the richest dietary sources of vitamin D on Earth. A single serving of wild-caught salmon contains more vitamin D than most people in the industrialized world get from sunlight exposure in an entire week. Hunter-gatherers living in Scandinavia, Britain, the Baltic coast, they fished. They ate seal meat and whale blubber. They consumed land animal organs, especially liver, which concentrates vitamin D at relatively high levels. They ate bird eggs. They ate a diet that, while insufficient to fully replace what UV synthesis would have provided, at least kept deficiency from becoming immediately, acutely fatal. A dark-skinned hunter-gatherer in prehistoric Britain could survive. Probably imperfectly. Some rickets, some developmental compromise, and higher infant mortality than equivalent populations further south. But survive. Then farming arrived. The Neolithic farmers who spread agriculture into northern Europe starting around 8,000 years ago, migrating from the Middle East and Anatolia, brought their crops with them. They settled inland, away from coastlines and major river systems, because that's where the best agricultural land was. They stopped fishing. They stopped hunting regularly. Their diet became grain, wheat, barley, porridge, bread, flatcakes, maybe some legumes, maybe some domestic animal milk or cheese if they were early adopters of pastoralism. Almost no fish, almost no fatty meat, almost no organ meat. The dietary vitamin D safety net was gone. Now, you have a dark-skinned population living at 50 degrees north latitude, eating an exclusively plant and grain diet in an environment where the sun produces meaningful UVB for perhaps 3 to 4 months per year, and where their skin blocks 90% of even that meager radiation. The vitamin D crisis, which had been a chronic slow burn problem for the hunter-gatherers of Northern Europe, became an acute emergency. Rickets among children became epidemic. The skeletal record from early Neolithic agricultural sites in Northern Europe shows extraordinary rates of pelvic deformity and developmental bone disease, rates that exceed even the hunter-gatherer populations preceding them. Mothers were dying in childbirth at rates that threatened community viability. Children were dying in infancy at rates that made generational survival precarious. And into this pressure cooker, this perfect evolutionary storm of low UV, nutritional depletion, and reproductive mortality, the SLC24A5 mutation was already floating in the gene pool at low frequency. It was about to have its moment. The numbers are almost hard to believe. Geneticists who study population genomics have a concept called selection coefficient, a measure of the survival and reproductive advantage provided by a given genetic variant. A selection coefficient of 1% means that carriers of the variant have, on average, a 1% higher rate of successful reproduction per generation. At that rate, a new beneficial mutation takes roughly 10,000 generations, about 200,000 years, to spread from rare to common in a population. The SLC24A5 sweep in European populations shows a selection coefficient that some estimates put at between 5 and 10%. Others suggest it may have been even higher during peak agricultural pressure. At 10% selection advantage, a mutation goes from rare to universal in a population in roughly 300 to 500 generations. 300 to 500 generations. At roughly 25 years per generation, that's 7,500 to 12,500 years. That is the genetic equivalent of a detonation. The ancient DNA evidence corroborates this timeline almost exactly. In samples older than 10,000 years, light skin variants are rare or absent. In samples from 5 to 7,000 years ago, during the height of the Neolithic agricultural expansion into Northern Europe, they are already rising rapidly. By 3,000 years ago, they approach the near-universal frequencies we see today. In evolutionary terms, this isn't gradual adaptation. This is a stampede. And it wasn't just happening in one place. The same accelerated process, driven by the same agricultural nutritional dynamic through different genetic mechanisms, was occurring simultaneously across the range of northern agricultural expansion. In East Asia, in South Asia, along the steppe corridors of Central Asia. Everywhere, humans had adopted grain-based agriculture at latitudes above roughly 40 degrees north. Selection for lighter skin went into overdrive. The people living through this had no idea it was happening. They didn't know about genetics or UV radiation or vitamin D. They just knew that some children were sicker than others, that some women survived childbirth and others didn't, that some families seemed to thrive through the long gray winters and others dwindled. They couldn't see the mechanism, but the mechanism was operating on them with perfect, impersonal mathematical precision. If the entire story of skin lightening is about vitamin D synthesis in low UV environments, then the Inuit and other Arctic peoples represent a devastating test case. They live at some of the highest latitudes on Earth. Parts of Greenland receive essentially no UVB for 5 to 6 months of the year. By the logic we've been building, they should have evolved the palest skin on the planet. Instead, they have relatively dark skin. For decades, this looked like a fatal flaw in the whole vitamin D hypothesis. The resolution of this apparent paradox is one of the most elegant demonstrations of the interplay between biology and culture in all of evolutionary science. The Inuit solved the vitamin D problem without changing their skin. How? By eating the answer. Traditional Inuit diet is almost exclusively animal products: seal meat, whale blubber, Arctic char, caribou, polar bear liver. These aren't just protein sources. They are among the most vitamin D-dense foods that exist on Earth. Marine mammals in particular accumulate extraordinary concentrations of vitamin D in their fat tissue. A traditional Inuit diet can provide vitamin D intake that exceeds even what aggressive sun-seeking behavior could achieve in temperate latitudes. The Inuit were drinking vitamin D, eating it with every meal, absorbing it through gut epithelium rather than synthesizing it through skin. And because their diet fully addressed the vitamin D problem, there was never meaningful evolutionary pressure to lighten their skin. The selection pressure that drove the lightning-fast genetic transformation of European and East Asian populations simply wasn't acting on them. They had done something remarkable. They had used culture, a specific, refined, specialized dietary culture built over thousands of years, to neutralize a biological selection pressure that was reshaping the genetics of entire continents. This is the Inuit demonstrating, across generations, that human evolution isn't just about genes. It's about the interaction between genes and the choices, the technologies, the diets, the cultures that human intelligence creates. It's a preview of what's coming in our final act, but we're not there yet. We now understand why pale skin evolved in Europe and East Asia, and why it didn't evolve in the Arctic. But the story of what happened to northern populations isn't just about skin color. It turns out that when your environment starts killing your people, evolution doesn't just tweak one gene. It goes on a shopping spree. The same pressures that lightened northern skin also changed eyes, hair, nose shape, and even body proportions. And that package of changes, assembled over tens of thousands of years, is about to get us to one of the most politically charged topics in modern science. Blue eyes are not blue. There is no blue pigment in a blue eye. None. What you're seeing is physics. The iris of a brown or dark eye contains high concentrations of melanin, the same pigment that makes dark skin dark. When light enters the iris, it's mostly absorbed. What bounces back is brown. In the irises of people with light eye color, the melanin concentration has been reduced by genetic variants, primarily in a gene called OCA2, sitting on chromosome 15, and the regulatory region upstream of it that acts as a kind of volume control for melanin production. Without much melanin in the iris stroma, incoming light scatters off the collagen fibers and other structural proteins. Short wavelengths, the blue part of the spectrum, scatter more readily than long wavelengths. Your eye interprets that scattered short-wave light as blue. Exactly the same physics that makes the sky blue. Blue eyes are just a sky inside your head. The genetic variant responsible for blue eye color in virtually all blue-eyed people on Earth is a single nucleotide change in the regulatory region of OCA2. And genetic analysis reveals something extraordinary. Every blue-eyed person alive today, whether Scandinavian or Sri Lankan or Argentine, carries the exact same variant. Every single blue-eyed human being is descended from a single individual somewhere in northwestern Europe who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, in whom this mutation first appeared. One person, one mutation, hundreds of millions of descendants who see the sky every time someone looks into their eyes. Did blue eyes spread because they provided some survival advantage? Or through sexual selection, through the social dynamics of small populations where a striking, unusual trait might make an individual more memorable, more desirable as a mate? Honestly, we don't know with certainty. The selection signatures are present, but ambiguous. What we can say is that the variant hitched a ride on the same population expansion that was spreading light-skin genes through Northern Europe, and it stuck. Whether by fitness advantage, by social desirability, or simply by genetic drift in small founding populations, it became characteristic of Northern European populations in a geological eye blink. Blue eyes weren't the only change occurring alongside skin lightening in Northern European populations. Red hair, controlled primarily by variants in a gene called MC1R, represents a shift in the balance between the two main types of melanin: eumelanin, the brown-black pigment responsible for dark hair and skin, versus pheomelanin, a reddish-yellow pigment. MC1R variants that reduce eumelanin production relative to pheomelanin produce hair that ranges from strawberry blonde to vivid copper to deep auburn, depending on the specific combination of variants. Like blue eyes, red hair shows population clustering in northwestern Europe, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and shows genetic signals consistent with relatively rapid spread, though less extreme than the skin lightening sweep. Beyond color, cold climate environments were also shaping body morphology, the physical architecture of the human frame. Bergmann's rule, first articulated in 1847 by German biologist Carl Bergmann, describes a pattern seen across warm-blooded species. Populations living in colder climates tend to have larger, more compact body mass relative to surface area. The geometry of heat retention favors bodies where volume, which generates heat, is large relative to the surface, from which heat escapes. Arctic-adapted populations across multiple species show this pattern. Allen's rule extends this to limb proportions. Shorter, stockier limbs reduce the extremities through which heat is lost most rapidly. The skeletal record of ancient cold climate humans reflects both rules. Bodies became somewhat more compact compared to the lean, long-limbed frames of equatorial African ancestors. The differences are not dramatic. Humans are not morphologically specialized for cold the way Arctic foxes or polar bears are, but they are measurable and consistent with these thermoregulatory principles. And then there's the nose. Nasal morphology varies significantly across human populations, and a growing body of research supports a functional explanation rooted in climate adaptation. The primary job of the nose, beyond smell, is air conditioning, warming, and humidifying incoming air before it reaches the delicate lung tissue. In hot, humid climates, this is a less critical function. The air is already warm and moist. Broader, flatter nasal passages efficiently move large volumes of air. In cold, dry climates, narrow, projecting nasal passages with longer internal airways serve as more efficient heat and humidity exchangers. They warm the air more before it reaches sensitive airways. They recover moisture during exhalation. Population studies show that nose shape correlates with the temperature and humidity of ancestral environments more strongly than it correlates with any other variable. This is not a racial category, it's a thermostat. Now we arrive at what all of this has been building toward. The concept of biological race, the idea that humans can be meaningfully divided into discrete biological categories that correspond to the social groupings we call races, has been examined rigorously by geneticists. The verdict is unambiguous. It doesn't hold up. All 8 billion humans alive today are approximately 99.9% genetically identical. The entire visible diversity of our species, every difference in height, skin color, eye shape, nose structure, hair texture, every trait we've ever used to categorize people is encoded in roughly 0.1% of our genome. That's roughly 1 in every 1,000 base pairs. And of that tiny 0.1% of genetic variation, the vast majority, somewhere between 85 and 94%, depending on the study, exists within populations rather than between them. What that means in practice: 2 random people picked from a single African village will, on average, be more genetically different from each other than either of them is from a random person picked from Norway. 2 people with identical skin color can be more genetically dissimilar than 2 people with radically different skin tones. The traits we use to categorize people, skin color, facial features, or hair texture, are controlled by a handful of genes responding to specific environmental pressures. They evolved rapidly, independently, in multiple populations. They tell us exactly one thing with precision: what UV environment your ancestors lived in for the last few tens of thousands of years. That's it. That's the entire biological content of skin color. It does not correlate with intelligence. Intelligence is a complex trait controlled by thousands of genes operating in intricate networks, none of which are the skin pigmentation genes. It does not correlate with moral character, with creativity, with athletic ability in any simple or general way, with any of the characteristics that societies have historically attached to racial categories. The traits that vary between populations are overwhelmingly the superficial, recent, Easily evolved traits that natural selection can reshape in a few thousand years. Skin color, hair texture, eye fold, nose shape. The traits that matter most for cognitive and behavioral complexity. The brain architecture, the neural chemistry, the fundamental emotional and intellectual hardware of the species are shared nearly universally because they evolved before modern humans ever left Africa. Race, as a biological concept, as a claim about fundamental differences between human groups, is not just contested. It is not supported by the data. Two people of different races are, at the level of genetics, almost certainly closer to identical twins than the concept of race implies. What race is, accurately understood, is a handful of recent, superficial climate adaptations that humans overlaid with cultural and social meaning thousands of years after the biological facts were established. The melanin is a weather report. Everything else is a story we told about it. If you look at the global distribution of natural skin tones, the pre-modern pre-migration pattern, a clear gradient emerges. Darkest skin at the equator, progressively lighter as you move toward the poles. Not a set of discrete categories, a continuous spectrum, grades and shadings merging smoothly into each other. No clean lines, no sudden jumps. Sub-Saharan Africa. The highest UV intensities, the deepest eumelanin concentrations. Not because African populations are primitive or ancestrally original in some hierarchical sense, though it's true that dark skin is the ancestral state, but because the selection pressure for UV protection remained consistently intense. Mediterranean and Middle Eastern populations, intermediate skin tones, high enough UV to maintain significant melanin protection, but at latitudes where some lightening provided vitamin D benefits. The result, olive complexions, warm brown tones, the characteristic pigmentation of populations from Morocco to Iran to the Indian subcontinent. Northern Europeans, the most depigmented populations in the world, the product of the specific combination we've traced. High latitude, low UV, plus agricultural vitamin D depletion. The last to arrive at pale skin, and the most extreme in their depigmentation because the selection pressure was most acute. East Asians, lighter than ancestral dark, but through different genetic mechanisms and not reaching the extreme pallor of Northern Europeans, partly because East Asian agricultural expansion included more vitamin D containing foods than the European Neolithic diet. Indigenous Americans descended from East Asian migrants who crossed into the Americas 15 to 20,000 years ago, then diversified dramatically as they spread from the Arctic to the equator. Inuit, moderately pigmented, diet adapted. Temperate North American populations, moderate skin tones. Amazonian indigenous populations, notably darker, having evolved toward higher UV protection as they moved into equatorial rainforests. The spectrum is not a racial map. It's a UV map. It's a map of where your ancestors stood and for how long, under what kind of sun. The evolutionary logic we've traced was elegant because it was self-correcting. In the ancestral world, people mostly stayed in the places their skin was calibrated for. Dark-skinned people lived near the equator. Light-skinned people lived in the north. The match between melanin level and UV environment was, imperfectly but broadly, maintained. Then the modern world happened. Ships, trade routes, empires, forced displacement, voluntary migration, global labor markets, and in the last century, commercial aviation, making it possible for anyone to move from any latitude to any other in a matter of hours. The slow biological calibration that took tens of thousands of years to achieve was scrambled in historical terms, essentially overnight. Two mismatches define the resulting health landscape. The first, pale-skinned populations living under high UV conditions. Australia is the case study the planet handed us. The indigenous Australian peoples evolved in one of the highest UV environments on Earth. Over tens of thousands of years, they developed deep melanin protection suited to that environment. Then, over the last 2.5 centuries, large numbers of people of Northern European descent, carrying skin calibrated for the gray skies of Britain and Ireland, arrived and settled. Their melanocytes were never designed for subtropical Australian sun. Australia and New Zealand today have among the highest rates of skin cancer in the world. Melanoma rates in Queensland approach epidemic levels. Squamous cell and basal cell carcinoma are so common as to be treated almost routinely. These aren't evolutionary failures. They are precise, predictable consequences of putting Northern European skin under Southern Hemisphere sun. The second mismatch runs in the opposite direction. Deeply pigmented populations living in low UV northern environments. Dark skin that evolved to protect equatorial folate reserves now acts as an almost impenetrable barrier to the scarce UVB available at northern latitudes. The same protective genius that made dark skin perfect for Africa makes it a significant liability in Oslo or Toronto or Glasgow in January. Vitamin D deficiency in dark-skinned populations living at northern latitudes is a documented, measurable public health problem. Higher rates of rickets in children. Higher rates of osteoporosis in adults. Elevated risk of certain cancers, cardiovascular complications, and immune dysfunction, all conditions associated with chronic vitamin D inadequacy. Postpartum complications for women whose vitamin D levels have been depleted through pregnancy. The evolutionary logic is playing out in clinical waiting rooms. The ancient tension between melanin protection and UV penetration, resolved over millennia in different ways by different populations, is now colliding with a world where people routinely live 10,000 miles from where their ancestors' skin was tuned. But this is where the story takes a turn that no other species in the history of this planet can claim. We hacked it. Evolution is slow, painfully, catastrophically slow when the environment changes faster than genes can respond. But humans are not simply biological organisms. We are technological organisms. We build tools to extend and modify our biology in ways evolution never anticipated. Sunscreen, SPF 50+, a few pennies worth of chemistry, applied in 60 seconds, providing UV protection that dark skin took 100,000 years to evolve. Available at every pharmacy on Earth, completely accessible to anyone with light skin living in a high UV environment. Vitamin D supplementation, a tablet containing the equivalent of many hours of peak sun UVB synthesis taken once daily, providing full metabolic coverage for dark-skinned people in northern climates with essentially no UV exposure. Available over the counter. Vitamin D fortification, milk, cereal, orange juice, infant formula. Foods engineered to deliver the vitamin D that diet alone can no longer provide in the latitudes and lifestyles of the modern world. UV phototherapy lamps, prescribed by dermatologists for people with severe vitamin D deficiency, simulating the UVB exposure their skin needs and their environment doesn't provide. We've done something extraordinary. We've taken an evolutionary pressure that drove the transformation of human appearance across the entire northern hemisphere and neutralized it in an afternoon trip to the pharmacy. For the first time in the 300,000-year history of our species, skin color no longer fully determines where you can safely live. A person with the deepest equatorial complexion can thrive in Finland with supplements and awareness. A person whose ancestors came from Norway can live a full, healthy life in Nairobi with consistent sun protection. We have not escaped evolution. Evolution is still operating. It never stops. But we've overridden one of its most powerful ancient levers. We've replaced a slow biological signal with a fast cultural one. Let me tell you what the genetics actually shows, stripped of all the political and social overlay that has accumulated over centuries of misuse. It shows one species, not metaphorically, one species, biologically, measurably, unambiguously one species, defined by shared ancestry, shared capability, and a level of genetic similarity that would make any alien observer wonder why we ever conceived of divisions at all. Every person alive today, every person who has ever lived since the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, traces their ancestry to the same African population that lived 200 to 300,000 years ago. There is no exception. There is no branch of humanity that does not pass through that common root. The genetic bottleneck we mentioned earlier, the near-extinction event roughly 800,000 years ago, in which the ancestral human population may have dropped to fewer than a couple thousand breeding individuals, means we are all descended from an impossibly small founding population. The diversity we see today grew from that bottleneck. It is, in geological terms, a recent elaboration on a nearly uniform genetic template. The SLC24A5 mutation that produced pale skin in Europeans, it's roughly 6 to 20,000 years old. In a species 300,000 years old, that's 2 to 6% of our history. Blue eyes, one person, perhaps 10,000 years ago. The characteristics we've built entire systems of oppression and exclusion around, features we've used to enslave, to colonize, to classify and divide, are younger than the pyramids, younger than the alphabet, some of them younger than bronze. The diversity is real. The adaptations are real. The differences in skin color, hair texture, eye shape, these are genuine biological variations, not imaginary, but they are surface level, recent, driven by simple environmental pressures acting on a tiny fraction of our genome. They are the least interesting things about us. Underneath all of them, the same neural architecture that supports language, abstract thought, empathy, creativity, love, grief, humor, and story. The same fundamental emotional hardware. The same capacity for both extraordinary kindness and devastating cruelty that characterizes every human population in every era of recorded history. When you see someone whose skin looks different from yours, you are not looking at a fundamentally different kind of person. you are looking at a different answer to the same ancient question. How much UV did your ancestors' bodies need to manage? That's it. That's the biology. Everything else, every story built on top of it, was added later. 300,000 years. That's how long we've been us. Homo sapiens, modern humans, the species that looks back at you in the mirror every morning. For 240,000 of those years, 80% of our entire existence, every human being on Earth had dark skin. Your ancestors and my ancestors and every other ancestor of every person alive today carried deep eumelanin pigmentation, the biological shield forged by hundreds of thousands of years of African sun. Then, over the course of the last 60,000 years, as small groups pushed into environments the species had never encountered, bodies began to change. Slowly at first, then with the Agricultural Revolution's nutritional catastrophe at breathtaking speed, random mutations appeared and spread, not by design, not as an improvement, simply as accidents that happen to provide marginal survival advantages in specific environments, and so compounded across generations until they characterized entire populations. The result is the human spectrum we see today. Not a hierarchy, not a set of discrete types, a living, continuing record of migration and adaptation and environmental pressure, written in something as thin and immediate as the outer layer of skin. Your skin color is a weather report from a climate your ancestors lived in thousands of years ago. It's a fossil record carried on the surface of your body of what UV intensities your ancestral lineages navigated. It is not a moral category. It is not a cognitive category. It is not a category of worth, capability, or fundamental human nature. It is a record of sunlight. And here is the quiet, grounding truth that sits underneath all of this. We are one species. We have always been one species. Every attempt to divide us into fundamental biological types has run up against this fact and has had to build elaborate, fragile structures of mythology and pseudoscience to sustain itself. Because the data, the actual genetic data, the actual evolutionary record, refuses to cooperate. The diversity is beautiful. The adaptations are fascinating. The history is extraordinary, and none of it changes the bottom line. You are looking at your hand, a specific shade, a specific story, an echo of a specific sun in a specific sky over your ancestors' heads thousands of years ago. Somewhere else, right now, someone is looking at their hand too. A different shade, a different story, a different sun. Same species, same origin, same extraordinary, improbable chain of survival stretching back to a same small, dark-skinned population in Africa who almost didn't make it, but did. Their survival is the reason you exist, and everyone you've ever met carries that same inheritance. If this changed the way you see skin color, even slightly, hit like. Share it with someone who needs to hear this science. Subscribe for more long-form science that doesn't talk down to you. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what did this change for you? The next video goes somewhere equally uncomfortable, equally important. We'll see you there.